A great many of them have also believed that his existence is not in time. So, a great many Abrahamic theists have been committed to claiming, and many have claimed explicitly, that a timeless being has temporal effects. Since a timeless being has no temporal relations, this implies that something causes temporal effects without bearing any temporal relation to them. That may raise hackles. I now suggest that for theists, prima facie, it should not raise hackles, and I then consider arguments that it should. So first, my case that for theists, at least, this should be an acceptable claim. Abrahamic theists, at least, should stand somewhat easy with a timeless thing having temporal effects. For a great many of them are also Cartesian substance dualists about the mind. Cartesian dualists hold that our souls have no spatial location, but nonetheless directly cause events in our bodies. So they hold that a spaceless thing has spatial effects. Prima facie, if a spaceless thing can have spatial effects, a timeless thing can have temporal effects. I now expand on this. Many find it plausible that direct causation entails having temporal relations. But many also find it plausible that direct causation entails spatial nearness. For many physicists and philosophers, consider action at a spatial distance spooky, that's their term. If there's a spatial gap, and there are no causal intermediaries in the gap to transmit influence, they can't see how the influence gets from here to there. Thus, it's spooky. So they try elaborately to avoid action at a distance. They insist instead that direct causation requires contact or spatial nearness. Anything that might make direct causation at a distance seem spooky will probably make direct causation without any spatial relations at all also seem spooky. After all, both are cases of causation without spatial nearness. And if it's a good question how the influence gets from here to there without transmitting through intermediaries, it seems at least as good a question how influence can start nowhere and get to there. Cartesian dualists are content to go against all intuitions that make many think causation without spatial relations is spooky. So prima facie, they should find it equally okay to deny that causation requires temporal relations. That's one argument from the analogy with Cartesian dualism. My second argument that theists at least should sit easy with a timeless thing having temporal effects is going to speak for convenience as if there are concrete things named space, time, and space-time. This is only a convenience. I could redo it without this at the price of being a little more cumbersome. And the way I would do it would be to talk not about space, but about a first spatial thing, and not about time, but a first temporal thing. So here goes the quick and dirty version. Consider God causally prior to the existence of any space. God is then able to make space, but he is not then spatially near it, obviously. Suppose he then does make space. He does it despite not being near, because space does not exist to be near till he's done making his contribution. So, if God can make space, or I add now a first spatial thing, spatial proximity is not a precondition of causation. Some say that once space exists, God has spatial relations to it because he has caused it. I argue at length elsewhere that this does not, in fact, follow. Giving you that promissory note, if a spaceless God can make space, then prima facie, in parallel, a timeless God can make time. This is the more plausible if the space is just an aspect of space-time, for then making space just is making time. Here too, the other term of the relation is not there until he is done making his contribution. And so temporal relations are not a precondition for God's causation. And if you think about it, what I've just said about space-time or about time would go just as well for a first temporal thing. There too, there are no temporal relations until that first thing is there. So there being temporal relations between God and something else is not a precondition of his having causal effects. And I'm going to be arguing that arguments that making time or making temporal things give God temporal relations fail. These are prima facie points. Arguments could, in principle, override them. And I'm now going to consider some attempts to do so. Arguments that an atemporal God could not have temporal effects. My first comes from Robin Lepedvin, who writes that, I quote, "Time is just the network of causal relations between events or states. So if the creative act itself stands in a causal relation to creation, then that creative act is in time." If time just is the causal order, then whatever is part of the causal order is in time. So God's creative act is in time, and he himself is in time in virtue of performing a temporal act. That's Lepedvin's argument. But Lepedvin's argument hinges on a causal reduction of time. He says time just is the network of causal relations between events or states. Here are two other possible causal reductions of time. One would say time is just the natural causal order. The other would say time is just the created causal order. Neither of those reductions of time implies that God is in time if he creates anything. So if we accept some causal reduction of time, and I note that fairly few do, we need a reason to prefer Lepedvin's to the other two. Now, Lepedvin's is a little simpler, but simplicity sometimes must give way before stubborn fact. So to opt for Lepedvin's reduction, we need an independent argument that God's non-temporality is not one of these cases where a stubborn fact resists the siren song of simplicity. That is, we need an independent argument that God is in time. So Lepedvin's argument cannot move the needle on whether God is in time. I next take up one by William Craig, which is either the argument or my sketch of it on your handout. Craig writes, suppose that God did not exist temporally prior to creation. In that case, he exists timelessly sans creation. But once time begins at the moment of creation, God becomes temporal in virtue of his real causal relation to time and the world, which is in that moment new to God and which he does not have in the state of existing sans creation. At the first moment of time, God stands in a new relation in which he did not stand before, since there was no before. We need not characterize this as a change in God. Perhaps change entails a before and after for an enduring subject. But this is a real causal relation which is in that moment new to God, and which he does not have in the state of existing sans creation. So far I said sans just because I was going to get it to you phonetically. Now by saying sans, I show you that I do know how to pronounce French, which he does not have in the state of existing sans creation. In creating the world, God undergoes an extrinsic or relational change which draws him into time at that very moment in virtue of his real relation to the universe. Now, the argument is not the clearest thing. There are some exegetical difficulties, but I think what it comes down to is 1 through 4 on your handout. Whatever creates a temporal universe comes into a new relation. Whatever comes into a new relation changes extrinsically or undergoes something relevantly like an extrinsic change. Whatever does so is or becomes temporal. So, if God creates a temporal universe, God is or becomes temporal. Premise 2, again, was that whatever comes into a new relation changes extrinsically or undergoes something relevantly like an extrinsic change. I think that this is false. Everything whose existence has a first instant comes into new relations at its first instant. If it is temporal, it comes into, for existence, the relation of being existing simultaneously with itself. But it does not thereby change. Something changes only if it first has, then lacks an attribute. What comes to exist had no attributes previously, not even non-existence. So coming to exist is not a change, and anything you have at that first instant doesn't constitute a change or changing. Coming to be is not relevantly like changing either. In a change, one continuing thing first is not F, and then is F. In coming into existence, we lack the continuing thing, the prior possession of an attribute not F, and the and then relation between earlier and later states of the same thing. The cases have in common just being F and not having been F before. If this is enough to make something relevantly like a change, then if the number 2 is an atemporal Platonic entity, its being prime is relevantly like a change, since it has not before been prime. But an atemporal number 2's being prime is not relevantly like a change. So 2 is false. I also question premise 1, the claim that whatever creates a temporal universe comes into a new relation. The sole reasons we have to endorse it are that God was not in the relation earlier and stands in it due to an event. If that's enough, then a timeless God newly knows his nature, for he knows it due to an event, is currently seeing it, and because he is timeless, he did not know it earlier. Again, if this is enough, then and now I'm going to go into the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, God is newly the Son. For on Nicene Christian orthodoxy, God as Father brings it about that God is the Son. The Arian controversy was largely over whether he was Father before he was Son, and the Orthodox answer was no. Nicene Christians will not say that God undergoes something relevantly like a change from Father to Son, or call being the Son new for God. Either would be heresy. If God's being the Son is not new for him, I do not see why his being with creation would be. Anselm, in fact, held that the Father speaks the Son and creates in the same speaking. If that's right, the one would be new only if the other was. An effect needn't be anything new. God always sees his essence and so causes himself to know its contents. It is part of his nature to do so. Nothing newly has any part of its nature unless it begins to exist. And God does not begin to exist. So God's knowledge of his essence is an effect, but it is in no sense new. So either we do not have enough reason to accept Craig's premise 1, or one's sense of the word new is not thick enough for Craig's purposes. I add also, with a reference back to my discussion of premise 2, that God's knowing his essence never involves anything like a change, even though it is the case due to an event and it was not the case that he knew it previously. So I think two of Craig's premises are at least pretty questionable. Still, though Craig's argument fails, or so I've contended, the thought behind Craig's argument is harder to dismiss. Many believe that the ontology of causation involves a real causal relation. Relations obtain only if they have, so to speak, feet in all their relata. You are not heavier than a football till both you and the football exist. Plausibly, if God causes a temporal effect, there is a causal relation between God and the effect at the time of the effect. So plausibly, the relation gains a foot in the effect at that time, and plausibly it also gains a foot in God when it gains a foot in the effect. If that's not the case, then presumably the relation always had a foot in God. If so, it seems it would also always have had one in its effect, and so its effect always existed. This train of reasoning involving the causal relation is, I think, the thought behind Craig's argument. And if it's not, then it's just a related thought that I at least find harder to dismiss than I do Craig's own argument. I offer three replies to this. First, causal relations between events may take a while to establish and do not entail that both relata exist at once. I look at the night sky and I see a star. It is the star I see, or so I'd argue, not photons, air, sense data, or anything else. I see the star only if the star causes my perception, only if there is a causal relation between me and the star. Yet the star, we can suppose, is long gone, having been destroyed 1 billion years ago. Causation just is a cross-time relation, and so can in some way relate what no longer occurs or exists to what is occurring. Just how to understand this is, of course, difficult, but it is part of the data on causation. What goes on is at least this. When the causing event occurs, that provides one condition for the relation between cause and effect to obtain. The relation comes to obtain when the effect eventually occurs. It isn't required that the relation have feet in both relata at once. It's required only that its feet be there at the proper times. If this doesn't sound quite persuasive, then think of it this way. What's really going on is that there's an event in the past. That event provides one condition for a relational proposition about causation to be true. And then when the effect takes place later on, the other condition is met and the relational proposition is true. One could talk here just about relational propositions rather than about relations. Once we shake free of the feeling that we must talk about relations and that the relation we talk about must have feet in both relata at once, the thought I'm discussing loses its appeal. Here's a second reply. If there is a timeless God, events really are ordered in different ways in relation to different beings. As events really are ordered differently in the rest frames of different observers in special relativity. Here's why I say that. A timeless God has no future. But if events in our future were future to him, he would have a future. So events in our future are not future to God, nor is anything later than anything else in a timeless God's life. Because if anything is later or earlier in a life, that life is lived in time. So events later than our present do not occur later in God's life than our present occurs in God's life. And so events ordered as later than in our lives are not ordered as later than in God's life if God is timeless. And this is no worse than event 2, which is later than event 1 in one reference frame, not being later than event 1 in another. So what I've put out there is the basic thought that if God is timeless, the earlier later relations that events have in time aren't replicated in his life. Events in his life are ordered differently. That being so, we can say the following. If God is timeless, then from his perspective, relative to him, for him, the causal relation only ever has a foot in both relata at once. In other words, in God's life, it's always the case both that the causal relation has a foot in him, and that it has a foot in its temporal effect. It never begins to have a foot in either. But for anything temporal, there may be a gap between its having a foot in God and its having a foot in something temporal. Because it always was the case that the causal relation had a foot in God. In other words, as far back in time as you go, and say that timelessly the relation has a foot in God. But in many cases, it is not always so that the relation had a foot in creatures. So, one response talked about the general fact that causal relations don't need their relata to both exist at once. My second one has appealed to the difference in temporal ordering between events in a temporal life and events in the life of an atemporal God. A third response would be that perhaps a timeless God causes things in time without there being a causal relation between the two. Perhaps God sustains the universe, but no relation of divine sustaining links the two. Further, perhaps it is not the case that both have relational properties, God having the relational property of sustaining the universe, and the universe having the relational property of being sustained by God. Instead, perhaps one relational property, a property in time, is all it takes to have a case of causation in this case. In other words, it may be that, as in traditional Thomism, God has no relational property of being our creator and sustainer, but we have relational properties of being his creatures, and that's enough. Now, Craig fulminates against this. I now quote him, and I insert numbering he does not use in order to separate claims from my discussion. I think the passage, or at least and the number version, is on your handout. If the relation of some cause to its effect is unreal, then the cause has no causal relation to its effect. That is to say, the cause is not a cause, which is self-contradictory. All we can say in such a case is that the effect is related to another as the effect of said object or event. In truth, there is no real cause in such a case, only a real effect, but that seems unintelligent. Even if we adopt the Thomist view that causation takes place entirely in the effect, not in the cause, that only underscores the reality of God's causal relation to the world, since the world is admitted to be really caused by God, which is all that there is to causality. Thomism denies that God is literally the cause of the world, though the world is the effect of God. Let's sort this out. In the section I marked 5, Craig seems to be insisting that something really is a cause only if it stands in a real relation or has a real relational property. He gives no reason to think this. The Thomist can fairly call this mere table pounding or perhaps question begging. Nominalists who accept no relations at all and even no relational properties might legitimately ask, can't we nominalists believe in causation? Why not? As against 7, Thomists do think that the proposition God sustains the world is literally true. They just insist that its truth maker is entirely in creatures. I would think that if this proposition is literally true, God is really a cause. Craig's claim in 6 that nothing need be added ex parte Dei to the world's being really caused by God sounds like just what Thomists believe, so it's not clear to me what he's getting at there at all. The Thomist claim that causation takes place in the effect is all that's needed for the Thomist account to go through. If Holyfield knocks out Tyson, Tyson's losing consciousness takes place in Tyson. So, say Thomists, does Holyfield's causing Tyson to lose consciousness. Causation occurs where the cause's power lands, where it is applied to the patient the agent acts on. Holyfield's causation of the knockout takes place in Tyson's jaw or where his consciousness winks out, not in Holyfield. Of course, Holyfield does many things to make that causation happen, but actions that yield causation are one thing. The causation itself, i.e. the actions which lead up to the causation finally having an effect, is another. Apply all that to God, and you have it that God's sustaining the world takes place in the world, not in God. So, of course, the truth maker for the proposition God sustains the world is in the world, not in God, because that's where the thing happens. So if we adopt the Thomist view that causation takes place in the patient, there's no further problem here. And I think there is something to be said for the Thomist view, although I'm not going to be able to say it here. Instead, I'll move on to an argument by Graham Oppy. Oppy says that the claim that, quote, nothing brings about effects without itself changing is, I quote, an empirical generalization based on the widest sampling of experience, and so cuts against the claim that a timeless being could have temporal effects. If the claim that nothing brings about effects without itself changing is true, then any cause must be in time, at least once it gets involved in causing, since only temporal things change. However, there are counterexamples to Oppy's claim that nothing brings about effects without itself changing. Things can bring about effects after they cease to exist. My state of seeing the star is brought about now when I see it, even if the star winked out long ago. As the star does not exist now, it does not change by bringing it about now that I see it. Oppy could retreat to the claim that nothing makes its causal contribution toward an effect without changing, for the star made its contribution when it still existed by emitting photons, and it changed by doing so. Or again, he could retreat to a claim that nothing is the direct cause of an effect without changing. But anything that brings about an effect at its first instant of existence would not change by doing so. And so too, anything that makes its causal contribution at its first instant of existence. It is also worth noting that when Oppy argues his thesis that this is, quote, an empirical generalization based on the widest sampling of experience, he always appeals to the causing of changes in the universe. God's bringing the universe into existence cannot be a case of causing change in it, since it was not there before God made it. So even if Oppy's principle faced no counterexamples, it's not clear how much force it could have in this context. Finally, I turn to Richard Swinburne. He made an early and a late case that non-temporal causation is impossible. As far as I can tell, his early case consists entirely in arguing that temporally simultaneous and backward causation are impossible. For Swinburne argues these things and then supports his rejection of non-temporal causation simply by referring back to these arguments. Presumably, he's thinking that if we eliminate these two alternatives, we're left with the claim that any cause must precede its effect in time. But this just begs the question. The advocate of non-temporal causation insists that there are three alternatives to eliminate: simultaneous, backward, and non-temporal, if you want to get to the conclusion that all causation must run forward at time. One can claim that eliminating simultaneous and backward causation leaves only forward causation possible, only by just assuming at the outset that non-temporal causation is not possible. So that argument simply begs the question. Further, Swinburne's case against simultaneous causation is this. Suppose that simultaneous causation is possible, and event A at t causes event B at t, which in turn causes event C at t. Suppose too that, I quote, what causes what is logically contingent. Anything can produce anything. Then, says Swinburne, B at t could have caused not A at t instead of causing C at t. And if so, A at t would have caused at t its own non-occurrence at t. This, says Swinburne, is, I quote, absurd and logically impossible. And Swinburne thinks that we should reject simultaneous causation to avoid it. One short reply is that rejecting the claim that anything can produce anything is at least as plausible a way out. I do not see why I should believe that a power to heat could ever have as its direct manifestation becoming bored rather than becoming hot. Further, if the sequence is, as Swinburne claims, logically impossible, that itself sets a limit on what can produce what and on what simultaneous causations can do. If in one possible world A brings B about at t, and in another B brings not A about at t, then even according to Swinburne, it does not follow that there is a possible world in which both occur. So Swinburne's example just collapses. It takes with it his argument against the possibility of backward causation, for that is just another example of the A, B, not A story. Early Swinburne also offers a sort of causal theory of time. He says the past is what no agent can affect, quote, for reasons of logic, while the future is what agents can affect. Unless we accept this, he thinks, quote, any grasp we might have on the concepts would be utterly mysterious and irrelevant to anything else. Well, we've seen what you might do with a causal theory of time when we talked about Lepedvin earlier. But I've taken away Swinburne's sole argument for his definitions, and Swinburne himself later sketches a way to acquire the concept of being earlier than that does not lean on his earlier causal theory. So I take it then that the early Swinburne does not make a good case against a timeless God having temporal effects. Now here's Swinburne's later case. He argues this, I quote, I think this is on your handout. One could bring any event E into existence at a time only by beginning to act at a time that E does not exist. So E cannot be fixed by a direct cause acting at the same time as E. Hence, some part of E is fixed at any period during E's occurrence. For this simple reason, simultaneous direct causation is impossible. Therefore, directly causing an event must continue over a period that includes both the non-existence and the existence of the event. So if at any time t, God directly causes a mundane substance to continue to have the same powers as previously, he does so by acting on it both when it does not have those powers at t and when it does. But in acting when the substance does have the powers that it has at t, God is acting at t, simultaneous with the existence of those powers in the substance. Swinburne had just argued that simultaneous direct causation is impossible. So I'm not sure how to read this last, and I think there are difficulties in a number of places in this argument. Regardless, I'm going to call the two passages I've just quoted arguments A and B and say a bit about them. Argument A begins, one could bring any event E into existence at a time only by beginning to act at a time that E does not exist. That is, 8 on the handout, Necessarily, what brings E into existence begins to act before E exists. If that's true, Swinburne can stop right there. Since being before something entails being in time, it follows at once that only something temporal can have a temporal effect, which is E's coming into existence. So we want to know why we're supposed to believe statement 8. Swinburne asserts, quote, the concept of causation is the concept of naturally necessitating the effect, bringing it into existence when it was not in existence by when we were causing it, i.e. trying to bring it about. That statement tells us that in his eyes, 8 is a conceptual truth. His case that it is a conceptual truth seems to be a claim that we learn what causation is by experiencing sequences in which first something tries and then it brings about. And so there being this kind of sequence gets built into the concept of causation due to the concept dependence on these, quote, paradigm cases. However, not every feature of the instances by which we acquire a concept gets built into the concept itself. Suppose that as a young child, I acquire the concept of a dog only by playing with Fido. I always play with Fido indoors. I now go outside and see another dog. It is not plausible that it requires a conceptual change to recognize this new thing as a dog. But it would require that if the feature of being located in my house had become part of my dog concept, merely by being a feature of the examples by which I learned the concept. I have no quarrel with the claim that, quote, the concept of causation is the concept of naturally necessitating the effect, bringing it into existence. But Swinburne adds the last clause, when it was not in existence, when we were causing it. We don't need that last clause. We could stop before we get there, or else replace it with something about the counterfactual dependence of effect on cause in cases not involving overdetermination. Given these other options, Swinburne's claim about what the concept of causation contains is radically underargued. He's got to show us that these other things won't do the job as well as what he gives us, and that we do really need the thing he puts in there. He's really given us no reason to endorse 1, nor then to accept argument, to endorse 8 rather, nor then to endorse argument A. Since argument B depends on argument A, it too has feet of clay. But I add this. If, quote, at any time t, God directly causes, unquote, anything, he is acting in time. It won't do to assume that he is, from the outset, in an argument supposed to show that he can't act from outside time. So Swinburne must either delete the temporal reference or be convicted of question begging. Further, that God acts on a thing, quote, both when it does not have those powers at t and when it does, unquote, is ambiguous. It might refer to the time or timeless locus at which God exerts his power, but it might instead refer to the time at which his power has its effect. If Swinburne means the first, then again, he must either delete the temporal reference or beg the question. If he means the second, the premise cannot justify the claim that God is, quote, acting at t, taken as referring to a time at which God exerts his power. I began with a prima facie case that a timeless God could have a temporal effect. I then surveyed all the attempts I could find to overrule that case. I've argued that they all fail. If that's true, the prima facie case stands. A timeless God could have effects in time. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to the Q&A. Just because we're using the laptop for the speaker now, people will need to come up to this rather than just to the hour. Okay, questions? Either from the audience. Dan?
Thank you, Brian. Wonderful talk. Let me get the hand out. So I have really a clarificatory question. I liked your response to Craig's argument, but I wondered why you chose to deny 1 and 2, or, I mean, partly I wondered how exactly you were denying 2, and partly I wondered why you didn't deny 3 instead. So I'll just very briefly set out a vision that I have, that change involves there being temporary truths of any kind, so that in some sense, if God stands in a new relation, then there is a change. There is a change. The change is God coming to stand in that relation. But I don't, and so I think one could accept 2 on those grounds, but still resist the argument by denying 3, by saying, look, the fact that something stands in a new relation doesn't make it temporal. My coming to believe that the number 2 is the best number of all is not doesn't cause the number 2 to become temporal. And then you might say, well, look, we need to say a little more about what it is to be temporal or non-temporal. But the problem then would be in 3 rather than 2. And as I see it, advantage of going this way is that one doesn't have to one doesn't have to make a distinction between real and, as it were, unreal change, or substantial change and insubstantial change, although one could still make that distinction in some sense as between intrinsic and extrinsic change. So yeah, I wondered, sorry, that was a bit of a long digression, but I wondered what the motivation for denying 2 rather than denying 3 on the grounds of the nature of temporality was.
Okay. 3 says whatever, okay, my motivation for denying 2 is just the arguments I gave against it. I thought I had some against it. And if you think there's a way around it, I'd like to hear more about that in a moment, because you sort of alluded to the temporary truth thing, but you didn't really spell it out. 3 says whatever changes extrinsically either is or becomes temporal. I think that because I think that you only have change if something first is one way and then is another. When you've got first and then, you've got a temporal relation. So if you're going to deny 3, you'd have to show me a way in which you could have change and yet not have temporal sequence. Can you see a way to do that?
Yeah, sorry, I left the laptop. I should come back. Yeah, if you yeah. Hold on, I need to hand out. So could you say that last bit about 3 again for me?
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
My thought is that to have even an extrinsic change, it's got to be that the thing is first one way and then another.
Yep.
And that if that condition is not met, whatever you've got, it's not strictly speaking a change.
Yep.
But first and then is a relation of temporal sequence. And so if you've got, if it is the case that to have a change, it's got for a thing to change, it has to first be one way and then be another way. Any change has to involve a temporal sequence, or something that is a lot like a temporal sequence.
I see. So so correct me if I'm wrong, but your condition for being temporal is featuring in such a sequence. Is that correct?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying, okay, that is a sufficient condition for being temporal. I'm not saying that it's what being temporal consists in.
Yeah, I see. Okay. So yeah, okay. Thank you. Yeah, that really helps. And so yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Brian. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from back. Do you want to?
Do I have
Yeah. Probably best to come up here just for the sake.
Okay, I'm trying to go back to you saw a star, all right, in your talk.
Okay.
And say it's the sun that you're looking at, which will be about 8.5 light minutes in the future from us. So it's going to be there. Now, if we bring that back 5 billion years, if we look back 5 billion years in space, they say there's no sun there. So if there's no sun there when we look back in space, relatively speaking, as Einstein would say, but space exists going back 10 billion or 13.7 billion years, then we have a timeline whereby an event occurs and comes into existence 9 billion years out. And that's our star. And that's the Earth. And that becomes us later on, now. So, if you take all that as being one, the concept of one, except that at the beginning, the proto-universe, 13.7 billion years ago, it's in a baby form or a youthful form. And if coming into existence, a teenager has created this ball of sun, and now it's a 30-year-old that has you, me, and everything else in it here, could we consider that concept as being one, the one, through all time, relevant to the concept of reality?
Okay, could you pose your question again? You're asking, should we consider the universe across its history as the one relative to the concept of causation? I'm not clear what your question is.
Yes, as if it was, if you personalized it, say you gave a name to it and said,
Yeah,
it was David. And then you just said David created the proto-universe, David created the ball of the sun, and David has created the earth now as we are in existence. Now David has done all that. And so hence it's one.
and so hence it's one.
Yes.
The last word is.
And you're saying that it's David that has done all this.
Right.
Hence, so that's the cause of everything that's there in the material world as we know it exists as the universe. And so the problem then being is, okay, so as we're standing here, right, in the present moment of time, we look back and we see the universe in relativistic terms. So we're seeing it 1 million years back, 2 million years back, 3 million years back as you go. But this entity, David, sees it as it is at this, everything is in actually 2022, as it is at this present moment. And at 9 billion years back, when the Earth, when the sun wasn't in existence, that reality is there with it also, as everything is 9 billion years old. And at the very beginning, this David sees everything as it is proto-universe. So whilst we see it as, or at least as Albert says, we see it relativistically back in time, this entity David sees it as one, and one point in time with everything in it. Is that a possibility? And is that?
It seems like a possible view. You know, I mean, you'd be saying, in effect, that the universe is a conscious four-dimensional entity which is aware of its whole extent, and I guess that's something you could hold. I mean, it sounds a bit like Spinoza, and so nobody would claim that Spinoza's view was actually incoherent.
And then, okay, so now if you were to cause that name to be God. Okay, right, okay.
Thank you. Okay, so Martin.
Thanks, Brian. Good to see you. Hope you're well. So this is a question about the kind of overall dialectical position we end up in. So it seemed to me that you gave us some, you were trying to give us some prima facie reasons for thinking there's not a problem, and then knock down arguments that suggested there was a problem, so we should end up thinking there isn't a problem, and we got some prima facie reasons for thinking so. I was pretty persuaded by your criticisms of the existing arguments, but what I want to ask about is that prima facie bit at the beginning. So you were drawing analogies between space and time to kind of generate this idea that we shouldn't have this kind of this initial worry. It seems to me that you don't need to go anywhere near as far as someone like Lepedevin in thinking about time as being defined by causation in order to think that analogies drawn between space and time about causal matters might not be particularly helpful in this context, right? I mean, even if we've got a view where space and time are to be taken to be very closely analogous, we've got maybe a space-time model and so on, there's still differences between space and time. And those seem to be closely related, at least, to some of the stuff we might want to say about the way that causation is different across spatial and temporal dimensions. So I guess I'm kind of wondering whether there's anything, like whether we have something in addition to the spatial analogy that might make us think that also in the temporal case, there wouldn't be an issue about there being causation from something which is atemporal.
Okay, that's a good question, and I can see it being a worry that someone might well spell out into a further argument against the kind of thing I'm maintaining. I wonder if I might not get. Okay, your concern is created by the global differences between space and time and their relationship to causation. So I wonder if it might not just be a way around it to formulate the arguments in the way that I didn't do because I was being quick and dirty, and talk instead about God creating a first spatial thing and a first temporal thing. When you put it that way, there's no question about what the global relationship between space and causation or time and causation might be and how they differ. You're just talking about a couple of concrete objects. And the fact that before, whatever sense you make out of the word before here, before they were there was no space, and before they were there were no time. So that might be a way to step around the issue.
Thanks, yeah.
And if you did so, I think you'd be left with arguments running pretty much parallel to the ones I actually gave, but not raising that particular concern.
Yeah, that does sound promising, but if you'll allow me to push just slightly, I know we're not talking about a temporal first here, right? The first spatial and the first temporal event, or maybe we are, but I don't think we were. But nevertheless, the notion of first is a quasi-temporal rather than a quasi-spatial notion. So again, it feels like a strict analogy would be something like the most left thing or the most right thing rather than the first thing. Because just already using the language of first is generating, if not temporal relations, at least something that kind of piggybacks on understandings of temporal or other priority in a way that space doesn't have that notion of priority. So I wonder, even if talking about first spatial or first temporal thing is already bringing in material which would be different between space and time.
Okay, fair question. Okay, suppose I parsed first by saying the temporal thing or the spatial thing to which no temporal or spatial thing is causally prior.
Yeah, although I guess I don't really know what that would mean in the spatial case. What would it be for?
Oh, well, spatial things can be, okay. Causal priority between spatial things is just, like the relationship of causal priority between me and the ball I throw. There's nothing, it needn't be something, in other words, to use it as the way I wanted to use it there, I needn't be trying to come up with some kind of strange causal concept where spatial relations take the place of causal relations.
Yeah.
So you might well say that the notion of causal priority brings time with it, and so it doesn't really get you away. But then we get into a fight about the definition or analysis of causation, and that's just a big issue.
Yeah, fair enough. No, great. Thank you very much, Brian. That's really helpful.
And nice to see you, Martin.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Focusing on me. Yeah, okay, hi. Great, so I had a question about whether, so I'm persuaded by a simple argument about the star and me. I think, I'm seeing the star, so there's something that I'm seeing, and I'm not a Meinongian. I don't believe in free quantification or anything like that. I just think that there's no difference between there being something and it existing, so the star exists. And I was wondering how much, your sort of that bit of your argument depends on the non-existence of the relata, or rather, can you run the same sort of refutation of Craig's argument by just requiring that relations can hold between something that's in time and something that isn't in time. So, I come to learn about the number one The number one doesn't exist in space-time. Of course, the number one exists, but it's not required to be in space-time in order for me to come to learn about it. These are the kind, yeah. So how much does it depend on what we might call serious actualism or serious presentism? The idea that the rejection of that view, the view that the only things that can stand in relata are existing things.
Okay, it would be dialectically difficult to run the argument as one about me and the number one.
Yeah.
And the reason is that Quentin Smith, for example, has arguments that he precisely does argue that my thinking about the number one brings it into time, or even more. Maybe it was just there because somebody could have thought of it. So there are people who would want to make that case, and I'd have to take on that whole. I'd have to get into all that if I wanted to do it that way. I do need the idea that the star no longer exists to make my argument go. And that does set up a real problem for understanding how it can be that I'm seeing the star, particularly if you're a presentist. And I'm really not sure what to say about that. I mean, there's a big literature on that in the philosophy of perception, and I haven't dug into it. One thing, I was thinking about this last night in the shower, actually, and one thing that made me drop the soap was the following thought. Well, maybe could you go anywhere with the thought that I'm seeing the star at the present, I'm seeing it as it existing in its own present, although it no longer exists in my present. In other words, can you sort of, part of what's creating the issue here is the idea that sort of time is just this one flowing stream. It all flows equably, and it's the same. It's the same for everyone. In other words, there's I'm not putting this all. There's just one rolling river of time. Whitehead had a view on which time was really many different trickles rather than one rolling river, and things trickled in different directions in different ways, and things might be present in one trickle but not present in another trickle. And that's just a thought, which I gave, it took me about as long to come up with that as it took me to pick up the soap. But I'd want to pursue that if I had time.
So would being present in that sense be sufficient for existence, or that's still banned? It doesn't exist even though it's present for me.
I wouldn't want to split apart presentness and existence that way. But I'd want to say that maybe existence is a little funnier than we think it is.
Cool. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, sure.
Thank you. Looks like we have a question in the Q&A. Oh, no, that's just about previous recordings. Okay. All right, were there any other questions from the live audience? Yeah, of course.
Thanks, Brian. I'm back. Sorry. I just wanted to ask you to say a little more about the Thomist notion of causation, because I hadn't really thought very much about it, and I found it very difficult to grasp. So, I understand very well I liked your example of the punch causing as it were, the unconsciousness taking place in the punched person's head, being in some sense an event entirely restricted to their head. But you said something even and I assume this is just a difficulty one gets into in explaining this notion in English because it's so unfamiliar in some ways. You even said something, of course, you said as an aside, the puncher did something relevant to the coming about in some sense of the unconsciousness. But I find it very hard to see how one could, without changing the notion of causation from what we took, without introducing a new notion entirely, how that couldn't just be a causal relation between the puncher and the punched. So I just need to hear a little more, if you don't mind, about how an effect could be conceived as being how a cause could be conceived as being in its effect, or in the second part of the relation that we would normally say is the causal relation.
Yeah. Okay. One thing that makes it difficult to get our heads around the Thomist notion is that Thomists are working with a different conception of causal relata than we are. We post-Hume think of events as the causal relata, and the cause is an event, the effect is an event. The way Thomists think about it, in causation, you've got substances, and they are the primary causal relata. An agent acts on a patient, so Holyfield acts on Tyson. Holyfield's acting on Tyson is Holyfield's producing an event in Tyson. But the event in Tyson is you can look at it two ways. You can look at it both as Tyson's being caused to become unconscious and as Holyfield's causing Tyson to become unconscious. It's an event which has a relational property, the relational property of having its source in what Holyfield was doing up to the point at which unconsciousness is induced, swinging his arm, making it contact with the jaw, and so on.
Yeah.
Okay, so one causal relatum is Holyfield, another causal relatum is Tyson. The effect is the change in Tyson becoming unconscious. That effect is Holyfield's, quote, having an effect on Tyson, if you think about it. I mean, what is the effect Holyfield has on Tyson? Tyson becomes unconscious. Where does that effect take place? It takes place in Tyson. Where does Holyfield succeeding in making Tyson become unconscious take place? Well, it takes place in Tyson when Tyson becomes unconscious. What is Holyfield causing Tyson to become unconscious? It is Holyfield succeeding in making Tyson unconscious. So that, I think, strings it all together. It got kind of fast at the end. Did it hang together?
No, that really helped. Yeah, thank you, Brian. Yeah, that did really help. I had a vision there at the end where it seemed no, I can see the example. Yeah, the point about locating the causation where the event successfully terminates, as it were. That really helps. Yeah, thank you very much. That really does help.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you. Stick it. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Any more questions? Martin, yeah. Yeah, I think we've got time for one more.
Oh, absolutely. Go ahead.
Sorry, Brian, me again. Just a quick one, which I haven't really thought through, but I wanted to throw at you and see. I'm wondering about how transitivity of causation might or might not play a role here. So even if we don't think that God's direct causation might involve God in temporal relations, I wonder if God being an indirect cause of things might be more problematic. So if God causes X atemporally or as an atemporal being, and then event X causes event Y, it seems like God then causes event Y, but it's not true of God at the earlier time that God has caused Y. It's only true of God after X has caused Y that God is the indirect cause of Y. So it seems like there is some property with respect to which God is changing, which is whether or not God is the indirect cause of Y.
Okay, but it seems to me that you could just as easily say there is something with respect to which God is changing, only being the direct cause of X, because first, you imagine X taking place as time's rolling on. First, X wasn't there, and then X was. So I'm not seeing why indirect causation makes it different. Could you maybe spell that out a little more?
Yeah, sure. So I thought your response to the God causing X thing was, well, when X comes into existence, that's not a change in God or in X. Whereas it seems like if what's really doing the kind of immediate causation is something which is in existence, that might generate more of an issue, because we're now talking about, granted, Y coming into existence isn't a change in Y, but could it then be a change in X, in the sense that X is then becoming the cause of Y, and that might go back up the chain to God. So it seems I haven't thought it out properly, but I wondered whether there would be a relevant difference there.
Okay, I need to think about this some more. I'm not immediately seeing why there should be a difference, but I'm not sure that there isn't. One thought that occurs to me is that if God is atemporal, it's not like he has to wait for Y to come about, and then there's a change from his point of view. It's just that God is atemporally the cause of the whole sequence, X, then Y, then whatever Y brings about, and so on. So at least from God's own standpoint, the indirect case isn't going to differ. The question is whether from there's going to be something generated at our standpoint that's going to make an awkwardness for that. I can't help thinking again that if there were, there'd be the same awkwardness with X itself, with the direct effect, because just as the problem you're raising is, okay, first Y wasn't there and then X brought Y about, and does that make things different for God somehow? Well, first X wasn't there and then X was there. God brought X about. So there seems to me at least to be a considerable analogy between the direct and the indirect cases. And if I was able to handle the direct case, it seems like probably something similar ought to be available to say about the indirect. But again, I'll need to think about that some more. It's just not clear to me at this point.
Yeah,
Thanks.
likewise. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just double check that there's nothing else from the, I think that's just the old, okay. Okay, shall we finish up there then? Right, thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And I'll get back to Stan.
Thanks, Brian. Fantastic talk. Lovely way to end the day. Sorry, couldn't have you here. We'll raise a glass of Guinness.
Thank you.
To you shortly. And thank you to everyone for attending today. And we will reconvene tomorrow online and in person between 9 and 9:30 a.m. For another 3 wonderful talks. Oh yes, what is the question? Tell me. Where do I find the previous recordings? Oh yes, Steve, yeah, thank you. The previous recordings will be on the UCD Newman Centre website, but I'll send out an email to all attendees online and in person with the recordings. So yeah, you'll get those, Steve, in an email from me. Thank you. Okay, yeah, thanks very much, everybody.